America's debt examined. Currently America and its citizens owe roughly $23 trillion. Some of this debt is actually owed to itself. Some federal agencies actually take in more than they spend. Unfortunately, since other agencies operate at a loss, our government will take the surplus from one agency and use it to cover the shortfall of another, basically moving funds around on the books. The other debt is owed to public and private entities. Other foreign governments loan America money and in return get treasury bonds. The same goes for individual investors/citizens. Currently, individual investors as well as large financial institutions such as banks, mutual funds, insurance companies, and large public companies hold the majority of the debt. The national debt can be traced back to the Revolutionary War. The Continental Congress started borrowing money in 1779. The Continental Congress had a significant amount of debt from the Revolutionary War. More recently, America borrowed money from foreign countries during World War II. The United States actually began incurring debt before it became a nation. Leaders of the colonies borrowed money from France and the Netherlands to fund the Revolutionary War and their independence from Great Britain. The Continental Congress, which would come to be known as the U.S. Congress, did not have the power to tax citizens, so the debt continued to grow. By 1790, it was over $75 million, which represented a 30% debt-to-GDP ratio. When Andrew Jackson took office in 1828, the national debt was a massive $58 million. Jackson called the debt a national curse. An economic recession led the government to start borrowing again, and our country has never been debt-free since. But how did we get over $21 trillion in debt? One way to measure debt is to compare it to GDP, gross domestic product. GDP is the total revenue created within a country. Historically, America has hovered around the 50% debt to GDP. Only Presidents Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, John Tyler, and Franklin Pierce left office with the debt at 1% or less of GDP. In percentage terms, Roosevelt increased the national debt more than any other president. He added $236 billion, increasing the debt by over 1,000%. This was largely due to his instituting large government aid programs during tough economic times. Here is a quick list of the recent presidents during my lifetime and the debt that was added during their presidential terms. Ronald Reagan, $1.8 trillion, 49% of GDP. George H. Bush, $5,764 billion. Bill Clinton, $2,451 billion. Barack Obama, $8,938 billion. Donald Trump. We do know that Trump promised to eliminate the debt in 8 years and actually dropped the national debt by over $100 billion, but since then it has increased. Trump made some massive tax cuts which has stimulated the economy. This should lower the debt to GDP as a percentage, but historically lowering taxes raises federal debt due to less funds coming in to operate the government on. President Joe Biden has said he intends to pay down the national debt by reducing the federal deficit. High inflation actually makes it easier to pay down the debt. So what is the answer to eliminating the national debt? Well, first we need to be able to operate the government without going into debt. The annual cost of running the government is around $147 trillion, of which we run close to $700 billion in the red, otherwise known as a budget deficit, meaning we spend $700 billion more per year than we take in, and that number keeps rising each year. So what do we spend all that money on? First, we need to define mandatory and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is costs that have been made by law. Think Social Security, Medicare, or budget items that must be paid with no room for negotiation. Discretionary spending are budget items that are not mandatory and must be approved by Congress each year. The largest discretionary expenses are military and social programs. When government spends more money than it earns in revenue, which is mostly in the form of taxes, the government must borrow to pay for its mandatory programs and any discretionary programs Congress has approved. Currently we are estimated to spend over $6 trillion and bring in around $4 trillion in revenue. This leaves us with close to a $2 trillion deficit. In order to continue operating, America will need to borrow the funds to cover the shortfall, and this is done mainly through issuing bonds, which increases the national debt. Just like us as individuals who have to make tough decisions every day about how we spend our money, the officials we elect to represent us need to make some tough decisions on how they spend our money. Tough decisions include what you are willing to live without and what you are willing to sacrifice in the present to be better off in the future. Imagine if America got on the financial independence bandwagon and learned to